They didn't even slow down. The strike was clean, efficient, unremarkable. A small colony at the edge of mapped space, barely worth a footnote in any serious campaign. A scattering of habitats orbiting a dim star, a few surface installations clinging to a lifeless rock below. No fleet, no defenses worth noting. Just humans. The alien strike force arrived without announcement. No signals. No warnings. They dropped out of transit in perfect formation, weapons already charged, targeting systems already locked. By the time the colony's sensors detected them, it was over. The first volley erased the orbital ring. Not damaged. Not disabled. Gone. A flash of energy so precise it didn't even leave debris large enough to track. The second strike hit the surface. Where cities had stood, there was nothing. No fire. No ruins. Just absence. It took less than 8 seconds. 8 seconds to erase a human presence that had taken decades to build. Inside the lead alien vessel, the operation was logged automatically. Target, minor. Resistance, negligible. Outcome, successful. No deviation from expected results. No further action required. They didn't celebrate. Didn't pause. Because there was nothing to celebrate. This wasn't a battle. It was maintenance. Another small threat removed before it could grow. Proceed to next objective. The command signal passed through the fleet. Engines adjusted. Navigation updated. They were already moving on. Because as far as they were concerned, this system was finished. But they were wrong. Because something survived. Not a ship. Not a structure. A signal. Deep beneath the colony's surface, buried under layers of rock and shielding, an emergency relay flickered to life. Old. Outdated by most standards. But resilient. Designed for one purpose. To send a message when everything else failed. It activated automatically. No human left to trigger it. No one left to decide. Just protocol. The system reached outward, searching for a viable transmission path. Most channels were gone. Destroyed in the initial strike. But one remained. Narrow. Weak. Enough. The message wasn't long. It couldn't be. Power levels were critical. Time. Almost gone. But it didn't need to be long. Because it only needed to say one thing. The signal launched. Barely detectable. Slipping past the debris field, threading through interference, escaping the dying system just as the last remnants of the colony went dark. Inside the alien fleet, no alarms triggered. No warnings appeared. Because it was too small. Too insignificant. Just like the colony had been. The fleet continued on its course. Unaware. Unconcerned. Certain. Behind them, the system fell silent. A dead star with nothing left to remember what had been there. Except for that signal. It traveled alone through the void. Fading. Weakening. But persistent. Because it carried something more than data. It carried a warning. Across light years of empty space, past regions long forgotten, through networks that no longer saw much use. It kept going. Until finally, it reached its destination. Earth. At first, it almost wasn't noticed. Buried under layers of routine transmissions, background noise, the constant flow of information that surrounded a living world. But something flagged it. Not its strength. Not its origin. Its priority. Emergency classification. Highest level. Automated systems pulled it forward. Decrypted what little remained. And for a moment, no one understood what they were seeing. Because the message was incomplete. Fragmented. Damaged by distance and interference. But the core of it remained intact. A voice. Human. Faint. Oath. Static. There. Another break. Coming. The final word struggled through the noise. For us. Silence followed. Not in space. On Earth. Because the moment the message finished, everything changed. Not publicly. Not yet. But deep within systems most people didn't even know existed. Alerts began to trigger. Old protocols. Long dormant. Activated. Not in panic. In recognition. Because this wasn't unexpected. It wasn't even surprising. It was inevitable. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of ordinary command, a decision was made. No broadcasts were sent. No public statements issued. The world above continued as normal. But below, hidden beneath oceans, buried in deserts, locked behind layers of secrecy, something began to wake up. Not hurried. Not chaotic. Deliberate. Because whatever had just erased that colony had made a mistake. They thought it was just a small outpost. Insignificant. Not worth attention. Not worth concern. And as their fleet moved deeper into space, unaware of what they had just triggered, Earth began to prepare. Silently. Completely. Because that message, broken as it was, had said everything it needed to. They were coming. And humanity was already waiting. They expected noise. That was always the pattern. After a strike, especially one that clean, that absolute, there were signals. Panic transmissions. Emergency beacons flooding nearby systems. Civilian ships scattering in every direction. Sometimes, military response. Disorganized. Emotional. Predictable. The alien fleet had already begun monitoring for it. Wide-spectrum scans stretched across human-controlled space, searching for any reaction. Any sign that the destruction of the colony had been noticed. They found nothing. At first, it didn't register as unusual. Delays happened. Signal lag. Processing time. But as seconds turned into minutes, and minutes into hours, something began to feel off. There should be activity, one of the commanders signaled. There was no reply, because everyone was seeing the same thing. Nothing. Human space, vast, populated, active, was silent. Not quiet. Empty. Trade routes that should have been alive with traffic. Gone. Communication relays that constantly pulsed with data. Dark. Even background noise, the subtle electromagnetic signatures of a living civilization, had dropped to near zero. They are masking, another commander suggested. It was the most logical explanation. A defensive measure. Primitive, perhaps. Ineffective, but expected. Yet the deeper they scanned, the less sense it made. Because masking didn't erase everything. It distorted. Obscured. This was different. This was absence. As if entire regions of space had simply stopped. Expand the scan radius. The order moved instantly through the fleet. Sensors stretched further, pushing beyond the immediate human territories. And still, nothing. No emergency fleets mobilizing. No defensive formations assembling. No reaction. That was the part that began to unsettle them. Because even the weakest species reacted. Even those who knew they couldn't win. Still tried. But humanity was doing nothing. Or worse, it was doing something they couldn't see. Inside the lead command vessel, analysis systems began running deeper projections. Possible explanations. Delay. Disorganization. Shock. But none of them held. Because the timeline didn't fit. Humanity had advanced detection systems. Deep space monitoring networks. They would have known. They should have known. And if they knew, then this silence wasn't ignorance. It was a decision. That's not fear, one of the commanders finally signaled. A pause. That's control. The words lingered. Because control implied intention. And intention meant preparation. The fleet adjusted course slightly, recalibrating their trajectory toward the next target. Another colony. Larger this time. More significant. If humanity was going to respond, it would be there. They increased sensor sensitivity. Prepared for resistance. For something. Anything. But as they moved closer, the silence only deepened. No evacuation signals. No defensive maneuvers. Even the colony itself showed minimal activity. It's still operational, an analyst confirmed. Power readings were stable. Infrastructure intact. But something about it was wrong. Too still. Too quiet. Like it was waiting. The fleet slowed. Not out of caution. Out of uncertainty. Because this didn't match any known pattern. This isn't a natural response, another commander signaled. No, came the reply. It's not. They ran deeper scans, pushing into frequencies most civilizations didn't even know how to use. Searching for hidden signals. Encrypted networks. Anything. And then, for just a moment, they saw it. A spike. So brief it almost didn't exist. Buried beneath layers of nothing. Gone before they could isolate it. What was that? No answer. Because it was already gone. But it had been there. And that meant something was happening. Just not where they could see it. The realization spread slowly. Then all at once. They weren't facing a civilization in panic. They were facing one that had already moved past it. Whatever humanity was doing, it wasn't reactive. It wasn't desperate. It was controlled, deliberate, hidden. And the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with something they couldn't yet detect. Something waiting. Back on Earth, no public announcements were made. No alerts broadcast. No visible military mobilization. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. But beneath that illusion, systems were activating. Old systems. Deep systems. Ones that had been built long before this moment. For this exact moment. Across oceans, beneath kilometers of water, structures powered on. In deserts, buried under layers of sand and stone. Sealed facilities opened. In orbit, far beyond civilian tracking. Objects shifted. Not moving toward battle. Positioning. Aligning. Waking. And all of it. Silent. Because whatever was coming, humanity didn't intend to meet it with panic. Or noise. Or warning. They intended to meet it. Prepared. And as the alien fleet moved deeper into what they thought was undefended space, that silence followed them. Heavy. Unnatural. Wrong. Because it wasn't the absence of action. It was the absence of visible action. And that was far more dangerous. The silence didn't stay contained. It couldn't. Human space sat at the crossroads of too many trade routes, too many observation points, too many curious eyes. And when something that large, that active, went completely dark, people noticed. At first, it was subtle. A delayed shipment here. A missing signal there. A merchant vessel arriving at a relay station that should have been alive with traffic. And finding it empty. Not abandoned. Just inactive. The lights were still on. The systems still powered. But no one answered. No signals transmitted. No ships moved. Like the entire network had been paused. That was the first ripple. Then came the second. Deep space monitoring arrays, belonging to civilizations far beyond human borders, began reporting anomalies. Not in what they saw. In what they didn't. Human transmissions had always been loud. Not chaotic. But constant. Data streams. Navigation pings. Civilian chatter. A living system, always in motion. Now, nothing. Across entire sectors. Silence. And silence. In a galaxy that never truly stopped moving. Was impossible to ignore. They've gone dark. The phrase spread quickly. At first, it was dismissed. A localized failure. A network issue. But as more reports came in, from different regions, different observers, the truth became unavoidable. It wasn't an accident. It was a shutdown. Deliberate. Complete. And that's when the unease began. Because other civilizations knew humanity. Not perfectly, but enough. They had fought them before. Traded with them. Studied them. Humans were many things. Adaptable. Resilient. Unpredictable. But one thing they were not. Was quiet. Even in defeat. They weren't quiet. There were records. Old conflicts, scattered across archived systems. Battles where human forces had been outmatched. Outnumbered. where they had lost. But even then, they had resisted, fought until the last possible moment, broadcast warnings, called for aid. They reacted. Always. So this silence, didn't make sense. They should be mobilizing, one observer from a distant system said. They should be signaling for allies. They should be doing something. But they weren't. And that was the problem. Because the longer it continued, the more it felt like something else. Not weakness. Not fear. Preparation. Rumors began to spread. Quiet at first. Then louder. Across trade channels. Across diplomatic networks. Across places where information flowed faster than official statements ever could. They're not responding immediately. A pause. They never do. That phrase carried weight. Because it wasn't speculation. It was history. There were patterns in how humanity fought. They didn't rush. They didn't react emotionally. Not when it mattered. They absorbed. Learned. Adapted. And when they finally moved, it was decisive. Overwhelming. Final. The stories varied. Some spoke of small human fleets appearing out of nowhere, striking with impossible precision. Others described entire battlefields shifting in ways no one could predict, as if the humans had already seen the outcome before the fight began. None of the stories agreed on details, but they all agreed on one thing. When humanity stopped talking, something was about to happen. And now, they had gone completely silent. Across the galaxy, attention began to shift. Not openly. No official alerts. No declarations. But eyes turned toward human space. Sensors adjusted. Observatories recalibrated. Watching. Waiting. Because even those who had never faced humanity directly felt it. That subtle, growing tension. Like standing at the edge of something vast and unseen. And knowing it was about to move. Back near the edge of human territory, the alien strike force continued its advance. Unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, the shift happening beyond their perception. To them, the silence still looked like weakness. Like fear. Like a civilization too stunned to react. They adjusted their trajectory toward the next target. Prepared their weapons. Because that was what the pattern dictated. Strike again. Before the enemy could recover. Before resistance could form. But somewhere, deep within their systems, a fraction of doubt had begun to grow. Too small to act on. Too faint to change course. But there. Because even they, in all their certainty, could feel it. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. And across the galaxy, civilizations that had learned to read between actions rather than words, understood something the alien fleet did not. Humanity wasn't gone. It wasn't broken. It was waiting. And when it stopped waiting, whatever came next would not be a response. It would be a decision. The first sign wasn't meant to be seen. That much became clear later. It didn't announce itself. Didn't flare with energy. Didn't tear through space with the kind of violent distortion most civilizations associated with faster-than-light travel. It simply moved. At the edge of human space, one of the oldest deep-range sensor arrays, maintained by a neutral observer civilization, registered something unusual. At first, it looked like a data error. A mass reading that didn't align with anything in its database. Too large. Not for a station. Not for a fleet. For anything. Recalibrate, the operator signaled. The system adjusted. Ran the scan again. The reading remained. Worse. It stabilized. That's when attention shifted. Because errors didn't stabilize. Errors didn't move. The array focused deeper, pulling more data from the anomaly. Position. Trajectory. Velocity. And then, silence filled the observation chamber. Because the trajectory didn't make sense. It wasn't random. It wasn't exploratory. It was direct. A straight line. From Earth. To somewhere very specific. Track origin, the lead observer ordered. The system complied instantly. Backtracking the path. Calculating the point of departure. And when the answer appeared, no one spoke. Earth. Not near Earth. Not within its outer defenses. Directly from its orbital space. Something had left. Something massive. And no one had seen it go. How did we miss this? No answer came. Because the implications were worse than the question. It hadn't been hidden through stealth. It had been hidden through control. Every sensor that should have detected it hadn't. Not because it failed. Because it had been allowed not to. The realization spread slowly. Then all at once. This wasn't launched, someone said quietly. It was released. The distinction mattered. Because a launch was visible. Chaotic. This was clean. Deliberate. Planned long before the moment it happened. The array pushed deeper. Expanding its range. Refining its focus. And then, they saw it. Not clearly. No visual feed could fully resolve its structure. But the outline, the scale, was undeniable. It was enormous. Larger than any warship ever recorded. Larger than most mobile constructs. Not elegant. Not streamlined. Massive. Purpose-built. And moving. Fast. Faster than anything of that size should have been able to move. Its acceleration curve didn't follow known physics. There were no energy spikes. No propulsion signatures. It simply changed position. Again. And again. Each movement precise. Measured. Closing distance at a rate that defied expectation. Destination? Someone asked. The system ran the projection. Calculated the trajectory across multiple possible paths. There was no deviation. No uncertainty. Just one answer. The alien strike force's origin system. Silence returned. Because now, it made sense. The silence. The darkness. The lack of response. Humanity hadn't mobilized. It hadn't sent fleets. It hadn't broadcast warnings. It had done something else. Something far more direct. They're not defending, one observer whispered. They're ending it. The words hung in the air. Because they felt true. Across the galaxy, more sensors began to pick it up. Not all at once. One by one. Fragments of data. Partial readings. Until the picture began to form. A single object. Moving with purpose. From Earth. Toward the source of the attack. No hesitation. No deviation. No communication. It didn't broadcast. Didn't identify itself. Didn't respond to hails. It simply moved. And the more systems observed it, the more unsettling it became. Because it wasn't just its size. It was its behavior. There was no scanning. No probing. No attempt to gather information. As if it already knew everything it needed to know. As if the destination was already decided. Far ahead, the alien strike force continued its advance. Still preparing for their next target. Still following the same pattern. Unaware that something had already been set in motion. Something they couldn't see. Something they couldn't track. Something that wasn't coming to fight them, but to find them. Back in the observation chamber, one final detail appeared on the display. A time estimate. Calculated based on its current velocity. The moment it would reach the alien home system. The number appeared. And no one spoke. Because it wasn't distant. It wasn't theoretical. It was soon. Too soon. That's impossible, someone said. But the data didn't change. Because whatever that thing was, it wasn't bound by what anyone thought was possible. And as it crossed another impossible distance without slowing, without signaling, without acknowledging anything in its path, a single thought spread quietly across every system that was watching. Humanity hadn't responded. Not in the way anyone expected. It hadn't sent a warning. It hadn't prepared a defense. It had sent something else. Something silent. Something direct. Something that didn't ask questions. And wherever it was going, it wasn't going to negotiate. They saw it coming long before it arrived. Not because it announced itself. Not because it broadcast intent. Because by the time it entered their system, it was impossible to ignore. Their outer senses were the first to register it. A mass reading that didn't belong. a velocity that didn't make sense. At first, they assumed it was a fragment of something larger, a drifting construct. But fragments didn't move like that. Fragments didn't aim. Identify. The command spread through their defense network. Thousands of sensors turned toward the anomaly. What they saw didn't fit any known classification. Not a fleet. Not a station. A single object. Enormous. And closing. Fast. How long? One of the commanders signaled. The answer came back immediately. Too soon. That was all it said. Because the number didn't matter. It wasn't enough. Across their home system, defense protocols activated instantly. This was not a frontier colony. This was their core. Their home. Orbital platforms powered up. Planetary shields initialized. Defense fleets mobilized from multiple sectors at once. Thousands of ships. More than enough to stop anything that dared approach. Because nothing had ever reached this far without being destroyed first. Nothing had ever forced them to prepare like this. Until now. The object entered their outer defense perimeter. And still, it didn't slow. No change in trajectory. No hesitation. No communication. Transmit warning, the command issued. A signal launched toward the incoming vessel. Clear. Direct. Unidentified craft. You are entering restricted space. Alter course immediately or you will be engaged. No response. The message repeated. Still. Nothing. The object continued forward. Unchanged. Engage. The order carried no hesitation. Because there was no reason to wait. Weapons fired. The first defensive line unleashed everything they had. Energy beams crossed the void. Projectile systems launched in coordinated volleys. A wall of fire. Precise, overwhelming, impossible to avoid. It hit. Direct impact. Multiple strikes across the surface of the object. For a moment, it disappeared inside the storm of its own destruction. Then, it came out the other side. Unchanged. Not untouched. Sections of its outer structure had taken damage. Fragments peeled away. But it didn't matter. It didn't slow. It didn't adjust. It didn't even acknowledge the attack. It just kept going. That's not possible, one of the commanders signaled. But the data didn't change. The object continued its path. Straight through their defenses. The second line engaged. Closer range. Higher intensity. Focused fire. Targeting the same points. Trying to break it apart. This time, the damage was greater. Visible. Chunks of its outer layers tore away under sustained fire. Energy signatures fluctuated across its structure. But still, it didn't stop. Didn't evade. Didn't counterattack. It didn't even defend itself in a conventional way. It just endured. And kept moving. They're not fighting back, someone realized. A pause. They're not here to fight us. That realization spread quickly. Because if it had been there to engage, it would have responded by now. It had the mass. The presence. It could have turned their own fleets into debris. But it didn't. It ignored them. Completely. As if they weren't the target. The third defensive line deployed. The heaviest ships in their arsenal. Command vessels. High-output weapon platforms. They moved to intercept directly. Blocking its path. Forcing an engagement. Hold position. The command transmitted. Final warning. Alter course or be destroyed. The object reached them. And didn't stop. For a fraction of a second. The system held its breath. Then. Impact. Not explosive. Not chaotic. Just. Inevitable. The human vessel didn't maneuver. Didn't attempt to avoid collision. It passed through the formation. And the formation. Broke. Ships that had held against entire fleets. Tore apart under the sheer force of contact. Not violently. Not in a way that suggested weapon fire. But like something far beyond their structural limits had simply brushed past them. Systems failed. Hull integrity collapsed. Not because they were targeted. Because they were in the way. The human vessel continued forward. Damaged now. its outer layers scarred, sections missing, but its core, intact, its trajectory, unchanged. "They are not engaging," one of the commanders said again. This time, no one questioned it, because the truth was clear. This wasn't an attack. Not in the way they understood. By the time they understood, it was already too late. Their fleets were still engaging, still firing, still trying to slow the thing that had torn through every defensive line they had. But the truth had already slipped through. Not from the battlefield, from the silence behind it. Because while their sensors tracked the advancing human vessel, something else began to surface within their systems. Fragments. Signals that didn't belong. Not jamming. Not interference. Something deliberate. "Trace it," one of the commanders ordered. Their systems complied, following the origin of the signal backward through layers of data. It didn't come from the ship. It didn't come from any known transmission point. It was already there, buried, hidden inside the data they had been collecting, the scans they had taken, the signals they had intercepted. The moment they had entered human space, they had taken in more than they realized. And now, it was speaking. The first line appeared without resistance. No encryption. No barriers. As if it had been waiting to be read. If attacked. A pause. The system processed the rest. Remove the ability to attack again. Silence spread through the command network. Because the meaning was immediate. Not defeat. Not retaliation. Removal. Permanent. More data unfolded. Not instructions. Doctrine. Recorded. Structured. Something that had been written long before this moment. Engagement priority. Source of threat. Their systems ran the logic instantly. Source of threat. Not the fleet. Not the strike force. The origin. The place that created them. Their home. The realization hit like a shockwave. "They're not targeting us," one of the commanders signaled. The response came slower this time. They never were. Because everything they had done, every defensive line they had deployed, had been irrelevant. They weren't the objective. They were obstacles. Temporary. Disposable. The data continued. Counter-engagement duration. Minimal. Another pause. Objective. Ensure non-recurrence. The words settled into something far heavier than any weapon. Because they didn't describe a battle. They described an outcome. A final one. Across the system, the human vessel continued its advance. Closer now. Its damaged outer layers shedding under sustained fire. But its core, still intact. Still moving. Still unstoppable. Inside their command structures, calculations changed. Not strategies. Outcomes. Projections that once showed victory, now showed something else. Something they had never modeled before. Total loss. Not of a fleet. Of a civilization. "They're going to the planet," someone said. No one argued. Because it was obvious now. The trajectory. The speed. The complete disregard for everything else. All of it pointed to one place. Their homeworld. The center of their power. The origin of their fleets. The place that made them what they were. "They won't reach it," another commander insisted. But the words lacked certainty. Because everything they had thrown at the vessel had failed. Everything. And now, they understood why. Because it hadn't been built to fight fleets. It had been built to ignore them. To endure. To reach its target. No matter what stood in the way. Back within their systems, the transmission reached its final segment. Short. Unambiguous. "This is not war." A pause. "This is resolution." The meaning locked into place. Because war implied two sides. Conflict. Struggle. This had none of that. This was a decision made long before the first shot had been fired. A response that didn't scale with the attack, but ended the possibility of another one. Forever. Across the system, panic finally broke through. Not visible. Not chaotic. But real. Because for the first time, they understood what they were facing. Not a species defending itself. Not a fleet retaliating. But a civilization that had decided. Once was enough. The human vessel crossed the final defensive perimeter. Nothing left between it and the planet. No more fleets to intercept. No more lines to break. Just open space. And the target. Below, the homeworld turned slowly in the light of its star. Unaware. Unprepared. Because it had never needed to be. Not like this. Not against something that didn't come to conquer. Something that came to end. And as the damaged, unstoppable vessel descended, unshaken by everything that had tried to stop it, one final truth settled across the alien command. They hadn't started a war. They had triggered an outcome. And there was nothing left that could change it. The moment it crossed the final defensive ring, everything broke. Not physically. That had already happened. This was something deeper. The illusion of control. For the first time since their species had taken to the stars, their home system wasn't secure. Their fleets, their weapons, their strategies had all failed to stop a single object. And now, that object was descending toward their world. The alarms came too late. Not because the systems failed, but because the meaning of what they were detecting took too long to accept. Planetary breach imminent. The message echoed across every command channel. Repeated. Confirmed. And still, no one moved at first. Because it wasn't supposed to be possible. Nothing reached this point. Nothing survived that long. Nothing ignored everything the way this did. Then the reality hit. Hard. Unavoidable. Evacuation protocols. Initiate immediately. The command spread across the system in an instant. Emergency networks activated. Civilian channels overridden. For the first time in their recorded history, their homeworld broadcast something it never had before. Retreat. Across the planet, cities lit up with emergency signals. Not warnings of attack. Orders to leave. Transport hubs overloaded instantly. Orbital elevators surged with traffic. Ships that had never been meant for evacuation were powered on, forced into service. Anything that could move was ordered to move. Priority, leadership, command structures, strategic assets. The hierarchy remained. Even now. Even with the end approaching. But beneath it, chaos began to form. Not loud. Not uncontrolled. But growing. Because billions of lives were being told the same thing. Leave. Now. Above the planet, the last remaining defense platforms fired. Not in coordinated volleys. In desperation. Every weapon that could still function turned toward the descending vessel. Energy tore through space, converging on a single point. Impact after impact struck its surface. For the first time, it slowed. Not much, but enough to notice. A fraction of resistance. A flicker of hope. Maintain fire, the command surged. Do not let it reach the surface. Everything they had left, focused on that one objective. Because if it reached the planet, they understood what would follow. The doctrine they had intercepted. The message they had decoded. This wasn't a battle. It was an end. The vessel pushed forward. Through the fire. Through the resistance. Its outer layers now almost completely stripped away. A core revealed beneath. Denser. Stronger. Untouched by everything that had come before. And still. Moving. Closer. Closer. Below, evacuation efforts accelerated. Ships launched without clearance. Without coordination. Some collided. Some failed. It didn't matter. Because time was gone. They won't make it, someone said quietly in the command network. No one responded. Because everyone knew it was true. There weren't enough ships. Not enough time. Not enough anything. This had never been a situation they planned for. Because they had never needed to. Until now. The vessel breached the upper atmosphere. Friction didn't slow it. Heat didn't touch it. It descended like something that didn't belong to the laws of their world. And as it did, something else became clear. It wasn't targeting cities. It wasn't aiming at population centers. It wasn't even reacting to the chaos below. Its path was fixed, straight, unchanging, toward something far deeper. The core, one of the analysts whispered. Not the planetary core. The infrastructure beneath it. The systems that powered everything, controlled everything. The foundation of their civilization. Because that was the true target. Not the people. The ability to continue. Above, the last defensive platform went dark. Silenced not by destruction, but by overload. Its systems pushed beyond their limits in a final attempt to stop the inevitable. It wasn't enough. Nothing had been. Across the system, evacuation signals turned into something else. Final transmissions. Records. Messages sent outward. Not to save themselves, but to preserve what they had been. Because now, they understood. This wasn't something they could survive. This wasn't something they could fight. This was something that had already been decided. The realization spread beyond their homeworld. Across their empire. Colonies. Outposts. Fleets stationed in distant systems. All receiving the same fragmented data. All seeing the same impossible truth. A single human vessel had breached their defenses and was about to do something no enemy had ever done before. Panic followed. Not contained. Not controlled. Because for the first time, their empire wasn't expanding. It was ending. And at the center of it all, the vessel continued its descent. Unstoppable. Unwavering. Not here to fight. Not here to conquer. But to do exactly what it had been sent to do. End the war. In one move. It didn't slow when it reached the final layer. The last barrier between orbit and impact. Meant nothing. Cloud systems tore apart as it passed through them, not violently, but with an unnatural precision, as if the atmosphere itself was being parted rather than pierced. Below, the surface stretched wide. Cities still burning with evacuation lights. Transport ships clawing their way into the sky. All of it. Irrelevant. Because the vessel didn't deviate. It didn't track movement. Didn't lock onto targets. It descended toward a single, exact point. Deep beneath the surface. Coordinates that had never been publicly mapped. But that it knew. Perfectly. Impact came without spectacle. No explosion. No shockwave ripping across the planet. The ground simply opened. A precise, controlled breach. The vessel vanished beneath the surface, as if the world itself had allowed it through. And then, silence. For a moment, everything stopped. Above, the remaining defense systems hesitated, because they no longer had a target. Below, deep within layers of planetary crust, the vessel continued, burrowing, not with force, with intent. Each layer of rock parted ahead of it, displaced rather than destroyed. A path forming, exactly where it needed to be. Far below, beneath infrastructure, beneath energy grids, beneath the core systems that sustained the entire civilization. It reached its destination. A hollow, artificial, ancient, the central nexus. The point where everything connected. Power, control, continuity, the heart of the empire. The vessel stopped. For the first time since it had entered the system, it came to rest. And for a brief moment, nothing happened. Back on Earth, deep within a command structure no public system had access to, a signal appeared. Simple, direct. Phase 2, ready. No alarms, no urgency, just confirmation. Around the table, no one spoke immediately. Because this part, had never been tested at full scale, simulated, modeled, prepared, but never used. Because it wasn't a weapon meant for war. It was a weapon meant to end one. Completely. One of the commanders looked at the data stream. Real-time feeds from the vessel. Environmental readings. Stability metrics. All within projected parameters. But still, there was hesitation. Not fear. Wait. Because once this was activated, there would be no reversal, no containment, no second chance. It wouldn't just stop an enemy. It would erase their ability to ever become one again. Confirm target integrity, a voice said quietly. The system responded instantly. Core infrastructure located. Synchronization complete. Another pause. Because that meant there was nothing left to wait for. Nothing left to verify. The weapon was in place. Ready. And beneath an entire world. It waited. Back within the alien system, something began to register. Not on the surface. Not in orbit. Deep below. Sensors designed to monitor planetary stability flickered. At first, they returned errors. Readings that didn't make sense. Energy fluctuations without source. Gravitational distortions that shouldn't exist. Then, a pattern. Subtle. Growing. What is that? One of the remaining analysts signaled. No one answered. Because there was nothing in their database that matched it. No known technology. No natural phenomenon. Just something. Building. Slowly. Inevitably. Back inside the buried vessel. The core of it shifted. Not mechanical. Not entirely. Something deeper. A structure that didn't operate like conventional systems. Layers unfolding. Connections forming. Energy gathering. Not from a single source, but from the planet itself. Tapping into its mass. Its motion. Its existence. And reshaping it. The device deployed silently. Not large. Not visually imposing. But wrong. In a way that defied explanation. It didn't emit light. Didn't generate heat. It simply existed. And where it existed, reality seemed to bend around it. Back on Earth, the final prompt appeared. Authorization required. No countdown. No automated trigger. Because this decision had to be made manually. A single command input stood between preparation and execution. The room remained still. Because everyone understood what they were about to do. Not a strike. Not retaliation. A conclusion. One of the commanders exhaled slowly. Then reached forward. For the briefest moment. Their hand stopped. Not in doubt. In recognition. Because once this was done, there would be no undoing it. No rebuilding what was about to be lost. No future where this moment hadn't happened. Then, they pressed the command. Authorize. The system responded instantly. Command accepted. Back beneath the alien homeworld, the device activated. And for the first time, the planet reacted. Not on the surface, but deep within. A tremor. Barely noticeable. Then another. Stronger. Across continents, the ground shifted. Buildings trembled. Structures groaned under sudden stress. Evacuation efforts faltered as systems struggled to compensate. What's happening? Voices echoed across their networks. No one knew. Because this wasn't an attack they understood. Deep below, the device expanded its influence. Not outward. Inward. Reaching into the core systems. Disrupting the balance that held everything together. Not violently. Precisely. Targeting the fundamental forces that kept the planet stable. And altering them. The tremors grew. Cracks spread across the surface. Not random. Patterned. Deliberate. As if the planet itself was being rewritten. Above, ships struggled to escape. But trajectories failed. Navigation systems faltered. Because space itself was beginning to shift. The weapon wasn't just affecting the planet. It was affecting everything connected to it. Gravity. Energy. Reality. Back on Earth, no one spoke. They watched. Because there was nothing left to say. Only the result. And as the readings escalated, beyond anything their models had predicted, one final truth settled over the room. This wasn't a weapon that should exist. It wasn't something that belonged in war. It wasn't even something that could be controlled beyond this moment. It was something that had been built. Because humanity knew that one day, they might need something capable of ending everything. And now, they had used it. At first, nothing happened. That was what made it worse. The tremors stopped. The cracks froze where they had formed. The chaos on the surface paused, as if the planet itself had taken a breath. Across orbit, escaping ships stabilized for a moment. Navigation systems corrected. Power grids flickered back into alignment. For a fraction of time, it looked like it was over. Like whatever had begun had failed. Hope, small, fragile, spread. Stabilization detected, one of the analysts signaled. Across the remains of their command network, systems began to recover. Maybe it had limits. Maybe it hadn't worked. Maybe. Then the readings changed. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just wrong. At the deepest levels of their senses. Numbers began to drift. Mass readings fluctuated. Gravitational constants shifted out of alignment. Not enough to trigger alarms immediately. Just enough to be noticed. What is that? Someone asked. No one answered. Because there was no reference for it. No model. No precedent. Just data. That didn't make sense. Below the surface. Far beyond where anything natural should be affected. The core began to unravel. Not explode. Not collapse. Unravel. The forces holding it together. The balance that kept the planet stable. Were no longer synchronized. They weren't failing. They were being rewritten. On the surface, the ground shifted again. This time, not in tremors. In separation. Continents didn't crack. They drifted. Pulled apart by forces that no longer aligned with the planet's own gravity. Oceans lifted. Not in waves, but in slow, impossible arcs. Water rising from the surface as if it had forgotten where it belonged. Cities followed. Structures tore free from the ground. Not destroyed, but displaced. Everything, losing its anchor. Above, ships attempting to escape found their trajectories bending. Not by gravity, but by something else. Something deeper. Navigation systems failed completely, because space itself was no longer behaving the way it should. Then, the first fracture reached the core, and everything changed. It wasn't loud. There was no shockwave, no explosion ripping outward. Just a moment, where the entire planet seemed to flicker, as if it had briefly lost its place in reality. And then, it began. The surface didn't shatter. It separated. Layers of the planet pulling apart in perfect, silent precision. Not chaos. Design. Chunks of landmass lifted away, suspended for a fraction of time, before breaking into smaller fragments. Then smaller still. Reducing. Not through impact, but through disassembly. Molecule by molecule. Structure by structure. Everything that had once been solid, becoming something else. Dust. Not burned. Not vaporized. Converted. The core followed, collapsing inward and outward at the same time. Losing cohesion. Losing definition. Until it, too, was gone. From orbit, the view was impossible. A world. Entire. Being erased without violence. No fire. No light. Just absence spreading outward. Ships caught too close didn't explode. They dissolved. Their structures breaking apart into the same fine particulate. The same drifting cloud that had once been a planet. Signals cut off one by one. Not in bursts. In silence. Until there were none left. And then, it was over. Where a world had existed, there was nothing. No core. No surface. No structure. Just a vast, expanding cloud of debris. Particles reflecting distant starlight. Drifting slowly outward. As if the planet had never been whole to begin with. Across the system, every remaining sensor locked onto the same point. Trying to process what they were seeing. Trying to understand how something like this could happen. There was no explosion to analyze. No energy spike to measure. Just the absence of what had been. Back across the galaxy, observatories that had been watching, recording, waiting, fell silent. Because this wasn't a battle. This wasn't even destruction in any known sense. It was erasure. Clean. Absolute. And undeniable. The human vessel. What remained of it? sat at the center of the expanding cloud. Damaged, stripped of its outer layers, but intact, unmoved, its purpose complete. No further action taken. No follow-up strike. Because there was nothing left to strike. The target was gone. And as the debris field continued to spread, slowly, quietly, endlessly, a single truth settled across every civilization that witnessed it. This wasn't power meant to win wars. This was power meant to make sure they never happened again. Because anyone who saw this understood exactly what it meant. There would be no second chances. No prolonged conflicts. No drawn-out battles. If humanity was pushed far enough, this was the result. A world turned to dust. Without warning. Without mercy. Without a sound. No one cheered. No victory calls echoed across Earth. No celebrations filled the cities that still stood. Because there was nothing to celebrate. Only silence. The same silence that had come before, but different now. Heavier. Earned. Across command centers buried deep beneath the surface, screens remained active, still displaying the final moments of what had once been an enemy world. Now, just a cloud. Expanding. Fading slowly into the dark. No one spoke at first. Because every person in that room understood exactly what they had just witnessed. And what they had just done. This wasn't victory. It wasn't even revenge. It was finality. A decision carried through to its absolute conclusion. One of the commanders finally leaned back, eyes still fixed on the data. Confirm target status, they said quietly. The system responded instantly. No planetary mass remains. No functional infrastructure detected. A pause. No further threat. The words settled into the room like weight. Because that was it. There was nothing else to do. No follow-up strike. No secondary objective. The mission had never been about winning a war. It had been about ending one before it could begin again. Far from Earth, the human vessel remained at the center of the drifting debris field. Damaged. Silent. But alive. Its systems cycling down. Its purpose complete. It didn't pursue the fleeing remnants of the enemy. Didn't hunt the scattered fleets now retreating in shock. Because it didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Completely. Across the galaxy, that message spread faster than any fleet ever could. Not through official channels. Through observation. Through fear. Through understanding. Every civilization with long-range sensors had seen it. Every intelligence network had recorded it. A world. Gone. Not conquered. Not occupied. Erased. Cleanly. Efficiently. And worst of all, deliberately. In distant systems, leaders gathered in silence. Some had once considered humanity unpredictable. Others had seen them as divided, emotional, even reckless. Now, those assumptions felt dangerous. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't chaos. It wasn't desperation. It was control. Absolute. Calculated. And restrained. Until it wasn't. They didn't escalate, one observer said quietly in a distant council chamber. They concluded. No one disagreed. Because that was the difference. War, as most understood it, was a process. Battles. Losses. Victories. A series of actions that unfolded over time. Humanity had skipped all of that. They had moved directly to the end. And shown exactly what that end looked like. Back on Earth, the final step remained. Not military. Not strategic. Communicative. A transmission was prepared. Not hidden. Not encrypted. Broadcast. Across every known channel. Across every reachable system. Clear. Unavoidable. No distortion. No ambiguity. It didn't carry data. Didn't include threats. Just words. Simple. Precise. And when it was sent, the entire galaxy heard it. We don't start wars. A pause. Long enough for the meaning to settle. But we finish them. That was all. No follow-up. No explanation. Because none was needed. The proof had already been seen. Felt. Understood. Across countless worlds, silence followed the transmission. Not confusion. Not disbelief. Clarity. Because for the first time, every species, every empire, every power that had once looked at humanity and seen uncertainty, now saw something else. Finality. A boundary that could not be crossed without consequence. Not prolonged conflict. Not drawn-out war. But an ending. Absolute. And irreversible. In the systems once controlled by the destroyed civilization, the remnants of their fleets retreated further into deep space. Not regrouping. Not planning a counterattack. Just leaving. Because there was nothing left to defend. Nothing left to fight for. And more importantly, nothing left to misunderstand. They had made their move. And they had learned the cost. One that could never be paid twice. Back above Earth, the skies remained calm. No massive fleets gathered. No visible signs of what had just occurred light years away. Life continued. But beneath that normalcy, everything had changed. Because now, the galaxy knew. Not through rumors. Not through speculation. Through certainty. Humanity did not seek war. It did not provoke. Did not expand recklessly. But if it was pushed, if it was forced into conflict, it would not respond the way others did. It would not fight to win. It would act. To end. And that understanding spread further than any weapon ever could. Because fear fades. But certainty doesn't. From that moment on, every decision involving humanity carried a new weight. Every calculation. Every approach. Because now there was no room for misinterpretation. No space for error. Attacking humans wasn't a risk. It wasn't a gamble. It wasn't even a war. It was a mistake. And as the drifting remains of a once powerful world faded into the dark, that truth settled into the galaxy permanently. A lesson written not in fire, but in ashes. And no one would ever need to learn it twice.